What kind of man leaves behind more graves than monuments, yet is still honoured as a national hero? This is the story of how one warlord reshaped the world through fire, blood, and silence, and why his shadow still looms over history. When we speak the name Genghis Khan, we don't just summon a man, we summon a storm, a spectre of galloping hooves, burning cities, and pyramids of skulls. His name rolls across the centuries like thunder from the steppes, a reminder that the world has, at times, been utterly rearranged by the will of a single human being. Not a god, not a myth, but flesh, blood, hunger, and fire. To some, he is a national hero. To others, a walking genocide. The claim that he killed 40 million people isn't just a shocking historical footnote. It's a number so large, it feels impossible. And yet, the earth still bears the scars. We begin not with his birth, but with his shadow, the silhouette he casts across continents and across time. From Beijing to Baghdad, Kiev to Kabul, whole civilizations cracked and collapsed under the pressure of his ambition. The legend is equal parts awe and atrocity. To the Mongols, he was a lawgiver, a unifier, a prophet of the eternal blue sky. To medieval chroniclers, he was an unstoppable curse, the scourge of God, sent to punish the world for its sins. Somewhere between these extremes lies a terrifying truth. Genghis Khan didn't just kill millions. He altered the course of demographic history. How do we even begin to wrap our minds around 40 million deaths in an age before modern warfare, before industrial killing machines, before global empires? That's the size of Argentina's entire population today. Or Spain's. It's not just death. It's depopulation. It's whole valleys emptied, entire cultures erased, cities so thoroughly destroyed they were never rebuilt. There are places where no grass grows, where no records remain, only bones. But numbers lie, or at least they whisper in different tongues. The 40 million figure isn't carved in stone. It comes from extrapolations, historical chronicles, and indirect demographic analysis. Some scholars argue it's exaggerated. Others insist it may be conservative, because the Mongols didn't just kill, they shattered the economic and ecological systems that sustained life. In Persia, the population dropped so dramatically that irrigation networks crumbled, crops failed, and famine finished what the swords began. Chinese censuses before and after Mongol invasions show catastrophic plunges, not just due to direct slaughter, but to societal collapse. It wasn't mindless slaughter either. Genghis Khan weaponized death. Massacres were messages. When the Mongols leveled a city, they left behind survivors just enough to carry the story. Resist us, the story went, and your children will be buried beneath your walls. It worked. Many cities surrendered at the sound of hoofbeats alone, but when they didn't, the punishment was absolute. The river at Nishapur reportedly ran red for days. At Merv, chroniclers claimed over 700. 0 were killed, though we must treat such figures with caution. The fact that they were written tells us something about the scale of the horror. And yet, Genghis Khan wasn't some mad butcher with a taste for blood. He was calculating, strategic, and ruthlessly efficient. His armies didn't kill for fun, they killed for function. The Mongol war machine wasn't a rabble of raiders, it was an organized, adaptive, and frighteningly modern force. Its doctrine relied on speed, intelligence, and terror. By the time Genghis rode westward, he turned psychological warfare into an art form, and mass death into a political tool. This is the paradox of Genghis Khan, a man of extraordinary vision who left behind a wasteland, a ruler who promoted trade, religious tolerance, and postal routes across Eurasia, but who may have caused the death of 10% of the global population. His empire fostered exchange, innovation, and connectivity, but it was built on ruin. What do we do with such a figure? Celebrate him as a founder of the modern world, or condemn him as one of history's greatest harbingers of destruction? And what of the 40 million? Are they a myth, a metaphor, or are they the silent weight beneath every Mongol conquest story, the missing voices, the erased families, the unwritten epilogues? In truth, we may never know the exact toll, but we know enough to understand that when we say Genghis Khan changed the world, we don't mean it poetically. We mean it literally. He depopulated continents. He erased kingdoms. He created the largest contiguous empire in history, but not by diplomacy alone. His empire was paved in blood. And when you look at the maps, at the archaeological ruins, at the desertified lands, once green and thriving, the death count no longer feels like an abstract number. It feels like the price of ambition unleashed with no limit. No mercy, no equal. So this is not a tale of one man killing 40 million. It's the story of how a vision for empire executed with terrifying clarity set the world on fire, and in its ashes, redrew the fate of nations. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer territory, he conquered time itself. The Mongolian steppe does not forgive weakness. It is a land of brutal winds and endless grass, where survival is a daily negotiation with the elements and your enemies. This was the world into which Temujin was born around 1162, beneath the vast, cloudless expanse his people called the eternal blue sky. Before he was a Khan, before his name shook empires, he was just a boy, hungry, hunted, and hardened by betrayal. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain who had earned modest power by force and guile. He named his son after a Tatar he had just killed in battle, a grim omen that the child's life would be soaked in vengeance from the start. For a brief moment, young Temujin knew the security of tribal leadership. But that illusion shattered quickly. When he was just 9 years old, his father was poisoned by rival Tatars, while seeking an alliance through marriage for his son. Power, in the steppes, did not wait for heirs to grow up. It devoured them. With Yesugei dead, the family's standing crumbled instantly. The Taichi Ud clan, who had once sworn loyalty, abandoned Temujin's mother and her children to die. Cast out, stripped of protection, they were left to forage roots, hunt rats, and boil bones. The woman who now led them, Hualun, was herself stolen from her first husband by Yesugei, yet she proved unbreakable. She taught Temujin to endure hunger, to mistrust easy loyalty, and to read the terrain of men as keenly as the hills. Survival meant watching your brothers in case they turned on you. It meant learning when to run, when to strike, and when to remember. These formative years were not tales of glorious adventure. They were stories of desperation, of stealing food from other children, of tying fishbones into knots to trick the stomach, of killing his half-brother Bekta in a power struggle that erupted over a piece of meat. That act of fratricide would follow Temujin all his life, not as shame, but as necessity. Authority, he learned, wasn't given. It had to be taken, blood-washed and fear-forged. He grew up watching the Mongol world splintered into clans and factions, each one quick to betray, slower to trust. Temujin saw what passed for order among the nomads' temporary alliances, broken promises, and chieftains who measured strength only by the enemies they crushed. But even as a youth, he dreamed differently. He imagined a world where law could bind tribes tighter than blood, where merit outpaced birthright, and where no man rose simply because of his name. What set Temujin apart wasn't his birth, or his strength, or even his cunning, it was his memory. He remembered every betrayal, every kindness, every promise kept or broken. When others forgot debts or slights, Temujin kept them in his bones. Years later, those memories would shape alliances and dictate exterminations. He would grant power to men from low birth who had proven loyalty, and he would slaughter aristocrats who had crossed him in his youth. The boy abandoned in the steppe would never forget the lesson. Trust must be tested, and tested hard. Captured once by the Taichi Ud who had exiled him, he escaped, using only a wooden split to hide his identity, aided by a sympathetic jailer. It was not strength alone that saved him. It was the rare spark of loyalty, earned through humility and humanity, even in the midst of violence. Temujin understood that fear could bind people for a time, but respect, even from the lowest ranks, could bind them for life. Marriage gave him his first true alliance. Berta, the daughter of a nearby clan, became more than a wife. She was a symbol of unity, a partner in ambition, and a source of both pride and pain. When she was kidnapped by a rival tribe, Temujin's rescue mission marked the beginning of his rise from fugitive to contender. He rallied friends and allies not by promise of plunder, but by offering something rare: purpose, stability, and a vision beyond the next raid. The boy born under the eternal blue sky was no ordinary warlord in waiting. The land had tried to crush him before it crowned him. Every winter frost, every gnawed root, every betrayal carved a deeper resolve. He had no birthright to power, only a will that would not break and a memory that would not fade. Temujin's early life was not romantic, not noble, and not clean. It was brutal, cold, and humiliating. But it was exactly this crucible that made him what he became. Not despite the suffering, but because of it. By the time he rode to war, he already knew what the end of the world felt like. That's why he had no fear of causing it in others. The boy who once starved on the steppe would grow to feed empires to the sword, and the sky above, eternal and watching, would remember his name. There is no wrath like that of a man betrayed while still starving. And for Temujin, betrayal came as frequently as winter on the steppes. His early rise was paved with pacts forged in blood and shattered by ambition. Before the world feared his name, Temujin had already buried the ones who broke his trust. What emerged from those betrayals was more than vengeance. It was the bones of a new world. A world bound not by tribe or birth, but by law. A law that would come to be known as the Yasa. But before law, there was blood. Temujin had once called Jamuka his Anda, more than a friend, a blood brother. They had grown up together, hunted together, laughed around the same fires. Jamuka, born of aristocracy, was expected to lead. Temujin, the outsider, was not. And yet, as Temujin's influence grew, drawing warriors, not through noble blood, but earned loyalty, a rift opened. What began as competition soon turned to war. The first great betrayal of Temujin's adult life would not come from a stranger, but from the one who once swore undying brotherhood. In 1187, the two Andas clashed in open battle. At first, Temujin tasted victory, but Jamuka, with more tribes at his back, returned 2 years later and crushed Temujin's forces in the Battle of Dalan Baljut. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a message. Jamuka captured Temujin's officers, those who had chosen him over tradition, and executed them by boiling them alive. It wasn't war, it was humiliation, and the kind that Temujin never forgot. The memory of that searing betrayal would echo through every alliance Temujin made from that day forward. He no longer believed in brotherhood, born of nostalgia. He would create a new kind of brotherhood, one bound by code, enforced by terror, and sealed not in shared childhood, but in earned loyalty. That was the seed of the Yasa. The Yasa was not a scroll nailed to a post. It was oral, adaptable, and brutal. It outlawed theft, lying, adultery, and betrayal, with punishments so severe they burned the offences out of memory. A man who stole another's horse could be executed. A commander who deserted in battle, death. But the Yasa wasn't just about fear. It created structure in a chaotic world. Under Temujin's code, even a low-born shepherd could rise to command thousands if he proved worthy. No longer would bloodlines dictate power. Merit would. That, too, was revenge against the old order that had cast him out. Loyalty became sacred, and betrayal, the ultimate sin. This belief was tested again and again as Temujin built his coalition. Men from rival tribes, some who had once hunted him, begged to join his banner. He accepted them, but watched them like hawks. Some proved true, and he raised them higher than princes. Others faltered and died screaming. One of the most infamous betrayals came not from an enemy, but from within his own fractured clan. After his father's death, the Taichi-U tribe had abandoned Temujin's family to die. Years later, when Temujin returned to power, he remembered every face, and he burned their power to the ground. The message was clear. Forgiveness was a luxury for the weak. Justice, under his rule, would be cold, final, and generational. Yet, for all his ruthlessness, Temujin didn't kill for sport. His retribution had purpose. Those who betrayed him were erased, yes, but their replacements were elevated with terrifying clarity. To betray Temujin was to sign your death warrant. To serve him loyally was to rise beyond your station. It was a calculated duality. The fear of obliteration, balanced by the promise of glory. As the Mongol army grew, the Yasa became more than punishment. It became the glue that held together a force composed of dozens of tribes, languages, and traditions. Under Temujin, the battlefield became a place of equality. Every soldier ate the same rations. Spoils of war were divided based on contribution, not clan. Cowardice, corruption, and favoritism were hunted down and executed without ceremony. Even his own blood was not spared. When his son Jochi was suspected of wavering loyalty, Temujin kept his trust in check. In the end, Jochi would be passed over in the succession, not by anger, but by cold principle. The Yasa was born from personal trauma, but scaled into imperial order. It allowed a man who had once eaten roots and murdered his brother over a fish to command an army that swept from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. It made Temujin something more than a conqueror. It made him a lawgiver. And in that law, as harsh as the steps that raised him, was encoded every scar, every betrayal, every lesson, carved into his bones. When Jamuka was finally captured in 1206, Temujin offered him mercy exile, even reconciliation. But Jamuka refused. He knew the world Temujin had built left no room for old loyalties or poetic endings. So he asked for a noble death, and Temujin granted it. No boiling, no spectacle, just a clean, silent end. That was the final severing of the old world. With Jamuka gone, Temujin summoned the Khans of the steppe to the Onon River. There, under the sky that had watched him starve, bleed, and rise, they declared him Genghis Khan, universal ruler, not because of lineage, not because of prophecy, but because he had forged something unbreakable, a new world where honor had weight, betrayal had consequence, and law spoke louder than blood, and so the Yasa, born of ash and betrayal, became the backbone of an empire that would drown the world in hoofbeats, not just by killing, but by rewriting what power meant. The steppe had always known warlords, men who rose for a season on the strength of their bows and fell as soon as their alliances cracked. But Temujin was different. He didn't just fight, he remembered, he adapted, and he outlasted. His rise wasn't the sudden spark of a lucky warrior. It was the slow, grinding wildfire of a man who understood that real power wasn't taken in battle. It was held together afterward. In the late 12th century, the Mongol plateau was a tangle of shifting loyalties and ancient blood feuds. Clans betrayed each other as easily as the wind changed direction. Alliances lasted only until the next insult or raid. Into this chaos, Temujin inserted something alien: order, not peace, never peace, but a structure that rewarded loyalty and punished treachery with surgical cruelty. He didn't promise comfort, he promised purpose. His army was not just a warband, it was a machine, and its parts were interchangeable. He broke up tribal units and reorganized his followers into decimal units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, ensuring that men fought beside comrades from other clans, not just their own kin. Old loyalties dissolved, new ones were forged in the furnace of discipline. The message was clear: you served the Khan, or you were nothing. Temujin didn't discriminate. A slave who proved brave could become a general. A noble who hesitated in battle could die forgotten. It was terrifyingly modern in its meritocracy. Men followed him not because they had to, but because under him they mattered. He offered a ladder out of obscurity. That ladder was soaked in blood, but it led somewhere. But he wasn't just a tactician, he was a reader of men. He knew when to make alliances, when to break them, and when to bury the past with a knife. He married strategically, creating bonds with powerful tribes. He adopted sons from conquered leaders, giving them status, but also binding them in obligation. He didn't just conquer enemies, he absorbed them. Their skills, their warriors, their symbols. And by the time they realized they were part of something larger, it was already too late to resist it. Fear, too, was a tool. When a rival tribe defied him, he made examples so brutal they echoed across the steppes. Entire clans were annihilated, their names erased. The Jadarat, the Merkits, the Tatars, all once feared names were ground into dust beneath his banners. Survivors were enslaved, children re-educated, warriors executed. The message rode faster than any horse. Submission meant life. Resistance meant extinction. Yet this reign of terror had a paradoxical effect. It brought peace. Not peace as in the absence of violence, but peace as in the certainty of consequence. Under Temujin, trade routes flourished. Caravan merchants who once feared bandits now paid tribute and moved safely through his growing domain. A unified steppe was a functioning steppe, and for the first time in generations, the tribes saw that unity could mean survival. By 1206, Temujin had done what no man before him could. He had bent the steppe to his will. The great Kurultai council of tribal leaders gathered near the Onon River. There, in a ceremony thick with incense, sky-gazing prayers, and the weight of bloody years, he was declared Genghis Khan. Not just a name, a title, universal ruler, not of a tribe, not of a people, of all beneath the eternal blue sky. But that coronation wasn't the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of an empire. In that moment, Genghis Khan was no longer merely a survivor or a general. He became an institution, a living embodiment of order born from chaos. He didn't just unite the Mongols. He forged a new identity, one that transcended tribe, language, and history. His enemies underestimated him because they couldn't imagine a world where a man like Temujin could hold power for long. But they were looking for an emperor in robes, not a warlord in leather. They missed the brilliance of what he'd done. He had replaced bloodline with loyalty, replaced old customs with new law, and replaced scattered warlords with a single, unstoppable engine of conquest. The rise of the great Khan wasn't an accident of history. It was the result of vision sharpened by hunger, ambition hardened by exile, and strategy learned in the crucible of betrayal. He didn't climb to power. He built the ladder, climbed it, then burned it behind him. By the time he took the title, the world had already begun to shift. Armies thousands strong moved at his command. Scouts and messengers traversed thousands of miles in days. Whispered legends of a new ruler, part man, part storm, spread across Asia. And in distant cities, behind thick walls and jeweled thrones, kings began to glance eastward with unease. Genghis Khan had not just risen, he had redefined what rising meant. He turned a fractured wilderness into a launchpad for empire. And soon, the rest of the world would learn that the man they had never heard of was coming for them, and he would not be stopped. War, for the Mongols, wasn't a last resort. It wasn't even a strategy. It was a way of life, ritual, rhythm, and reason. From the moment a child could sit upright, he was placed on a horse. By the age of 3, he could shoot from the saddle. The steppe didn't raise civilians. It raised warriors who could ride for days without rest, survive on dried milk curds and blood drawn from their own horses, and navigate vast, empty expanses by memory and stars. These were not soldiers trained in barracks. These were predators bred by landscape and necessity. The heart of the Mongol war machine was its mobility. No army on earth could move like them. Each warrior had 3 to 5 horses. Switching between them mid-journey to maintain speed, they travelled light, carried minimal baggage, and forded rivers, crossed deserts, and climbed mountain passes with a casual relentlessness. Where most medieval armies lumbered like armoured beasts, the Mongols struck like lightning. They could travel 100 miles in a day and still be ready to fight. And when they fought with precision. The composite bow, small and deadly, was the soul of their warfare. Crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, it could send an arrow piercing through armour at over 300 yards. But the weapon was only as deadly as the man who wielded it. And Mongol archers were terrifyingly accurate. They could shoot in any direction while galloping at full speed, twisting their bodies backward, sideways, and upside down. Battles became ballets of motion and death. No line formation could withstand that kind of chaos. But their brilliance wasn't just in movement, it was in planning. Mongol generals conducted detailed reconnaissance, often months in advance. Spies infiltrated enemy cities. Traders gathered maps, and prisoners were interrogated for terrain and troop data. Every campaign began long before the first arrow was loosed, and every strike was part of a larger design: deception, entrapment, annihilation. The feigned retreat became one of their most infamous tactics. A Mongol force would charge, fire volleys, then suddenly break and flee. Enemy forces, hungry for a rout, would give chase only to be lured into ambushes or surrounded by fresh Mongol units. What looked like panic was choreography. They didn't win because their enemies were weak. They won because they turned their enemies' confidence into a weapon. Discipline was enforced with a brutality that mirrored their warfare. Loot taken before the proper order, execution. Fleeing the battlefield, execution. Breaking ranks, stealing supplies, disobeying a direct order, death, without hesitation. The fear inside the ranks was as strong as the fear they inspired outside them. And yet, the rewards were equally stark. A herdsman who served well could become a commander of 10,000. Status was fluid, and that gave the machine its edge. Men fought, not just for plunder, but for place. But above all, the Mongols mastered the art of psychological warfare. They didn't just kill, they sent messages in blood. Before attacking a city, they would often offer terms: surrender and live, resist and die. If the city refused, the retribution was absolute. Entire populations slaughtered, survivors enslaved, their fates carried by fleeing refugees to the next city, warnings written in flesh. At Nishapur, after a Mongol commander was killed in an uprising, Genghis Khan's wrath was volcanic. Reports claim up to 1.7 million people were executed in retaliation, not just fighters, but every man, woman, and child. These numbers are debated, inflated by horror and oral tradition, but the scale of death was real enough to darken the pages of every chronicle that followed. The terror was intentional. The Mongols understood that fear travelled faster than horses. Cities fell before a single arrow flew because their governors had heard what happened to those who resisted. Yet amid the carnage, there was method. The Mongols spared artisans, engineers, scholars, anyone useful. They moved them across the empire like living tools, rebuilding what they destroyed. They destroyed order, then imposed their own. They shattered walls, then redrew maps. To resist them was to risk extinction. To join them was to be remade. And make no mistake, it was not mindless killing. It was controlled, mechanized, and executed with mathematical precision. If a city surrendered, it might be spared entirely. Markets reopened, taxes flowed, temples remained untouched. But if it resisted, there would be no quarter, no exceptions. That binary choice, submit or vanish, gave the Mongols their momentum. Every victory fueled the next. Every annihilation whispered across borders. The war machine wasn't just about victory, it was about inevitability. Facing the Mongols wasn't like facing an army. It was like watching the sky go black with arrows, hearing the earth crack with hooves, and realizing that history had arrived at your gates with fire in its eyes. For Genghis Khan and his sons, war wasn't merely a means to an end. It was a natural state of being, a sacred rite, a forge for the world they intended to build. And beneath the eternal blue sky, the rules of peace were rewritten by men who had never known anything but the thrill of conquest and the silence that followed. It began with a merchant caravan, harmless, fat with silks and spices, sent in peace by Genghis Khan himself, a gesture of goodwill to the Khwarezmian Empire, an invitation to trade, perhaps even to coexist. But in the cities of Persia, pride burned hotter than wisdom. The governor of Otrar saw the caravan as an opportunity, not for diplomacy, but for theft. He seized the goods. He accused the merchants of spying. And then, in an act that would shift the fate of millions, he ordered them executed. Genghis Khan did not go to war lightly. He sent 3 ambassadors to the Khwarezmian Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, requesting justice. One was a Muslim, a gesture of cultural respect. The message was clear: punish the governor, restore what was stolen, and the matter ends here. But the Shah, bloated with arrogance and convinced the Mongols were little more than barbaric upstarts, made the fatal choice. He had 1 ambassador beheaded, the others were mutilated and returned with shaved beards, an insult worse than blood. The Khwarezmian Empire had just declared war on a force it didn't understand, and it would not survive the reply. Genghis Khan's retribution wasn't immediate. It was methodical, precise, cold as frost on the steppe. In 1219, the Mongols swept westward, not as an army, but as a natural disaster. What came was not conquest, it was obliteration. The city of Otrar, where the insult began, was besieged for 5 months. When it finally fell, the governor was captured. Genghis had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, not for the pain, but for the poetry. A man who had lusted for wealth died by it, drowned in the riches he stole. From there, the storm expanded. Bukhara, once a shining jewel of Islamic civilization, fell next. The Mongols breached the walls and flooded the streets. Genghis entered the Grand Mosque, not as a vandal, but as a conqueror. He ascended the pulpit and addressed the survivors directly. I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. It wasn't a boast. It was a diagnosis, and the punishment only escalated. Samarkand was next a city thought impregnable, protected by tens of thousands of elite troops and high walls. It fell in days. The defenders, outmaneuvered and demoralized, were slaughtered. Skilled artisans were spared and shipped east to enrich the Mongol Empire. Everyone else was buried beneath it. The rivers ran thick with corpses, and the orchards were razed to ash. Everywhere the Mongols moved, they dismantled cities not just physically, but psychologically. They would build pyramids of skulls outside the gates, grim sculptures of what defiance earned. Survivors were driven ahead of the army as human shields. False deserters infiltrated other cities, spreading terror before a single arrow flew. The Khwarezmians weren't just losing territory, they were losing hope. And still the Shah fled. City after city collapsed, and still Ala ad-Din refused to face his enemy. He abandoned Samarkand. He fled south, then west, always one step ahead of the storm. Genghis didn't just want his cities. He wanted the man. The chase became personal. The Mongols pursued him across deserts, up mountains, through dead cities and burning palaces. He finally died in hiding on a desolate island in the Caspian Sea, broken, diseased, alone. Genghis never found his body, but he found everything else, and he burned it. But the Khan wasn't finished. The Shah's son, Jalal ad-Din, tried to mount a resistance. For a moment, it looked like he might succeed. At the Battle of the Indus, he stood with an army and dared to fight back. The Mongols swept through them like wind through wheat. Jalal fled by diving into the river, vanishing into India. Genghis, watching from the riverbank, didn't order pursuit. He respected the fight. That was rare, but it changed nothing. By the end of the campaign, the Khwarezmian Empire, once one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, existed only in memory and rubble. Its cities were shells, its libraries ashes, its scholars dead, its rivers clogged with the bodies of merchants, mothers, mullahs, and magistrates. What had begun as a diplomatic insult ended in genocide. This wasn't simply war. This was a warning, written in the language of annihilation. The Mongols didn't just destroy a state, they turned it into a ghost. The Khwarezmian catastrophe became legend, carried east and west by fleeing survivors and stunned onlookers. It showed the world what Genghis Khan was capable of when his hand was forced. Not just conquest, not just discipline, but total, surgical, merciless ruin. In the years to come, many cities surrendered at the mere rumour of Mongol approach. They remembered what had happened in Persia. They remembered the skull pyramids, the rivers of rot, the screams that echoed long after the armies had passed. They remembered that once, a governor thought he could rob a caravan, and 40 million deaths later, the world learned never to forget. A city is a fragile thing. It looks strong walls of stone, gates of iron, towers that scrape the sky. But it only takes a few days for that illusion to crack. Hunger, fear, and betrayal can hollow it from within faster than any battering ram. Genghis Khan knew this. He understood that to kill a city You didn't need to scale the walls. You needed to rot its soul. And so he made an art of it. When the Mongols came, they came without warning. Their scouts moved like shadows, charting every ditch, tree, and watchtower. By the time a city spotted the first dust cloud on the horizon, it was already surrounded. The Mongol army didn't march in lines. It flowed, encircling like a tightening noose. Escape routes were blocked. Water supplies were seized. Every bird that left the city was shot from the sky. Isolation wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Then came the offer: submit and live, or resist and die. Some cities surrendered, handed over their keys, and were spared for a time. Others chose defiance. Those cities died. The siege of Nishapur was not a battle. It was a reckoning. After the death of a favoured Mongol commander, Genghis Khan's own son-in-law, the great Khan unleashed a fury so complete it turned the city into dust. The population, perhaps hundreds of thousands, was methodically exterminated. One account claims the heads of men, women, and children were piled into separate pyramids. A silent taxonomy of extinction. Genghis didn't just erase resistance, he made it a spectacle. Merv, a shining star of Persian culture and learning, fared no better. It opened its gates, hoping mercy might still breathe behind the Mongol armour. It didn't. The citizens were led out in groups and slaughtered, methodically, mechanically, without anger. The goal wasn't just death, it was demonstration. By the end, perhaps as many as 700, 0 people lay still, their voices replaced by wind and ash. The Mongols turned cities into warnings, each one louder than the last. But brute force was only part of the method. Genghis understood the mind as a battlefield. His sieges weaponized terror. Survivors were left alive on purpose, maimed, broken, screaming so they could crawl to the next town and describe what they saw. Refugees became messengers of doom. When cities heard what happened at Bukhara or Urgench, many chose to throw open their gates rather than face the fire. The Mongols also used their enemies' own walls against them. Captured civilians were forced to the front lines, driven ahead as human shields, while siege engines rained destruction behind them. Engineers, many of them kidnapped from previous conquests, built catapults, battering rams, and siege towers using blueprints gleaned from China, Persia, and the Islamic world. They launched not just stones, but corpses rotting, diseased, bloated into cities to spread plague and panic. Early biological warfare, flung by rope and fire, the great walled cities that had survived for centuries, repelling crusaders and repulsing caliphs, were undone not by armies greater in number, but by a will greater in resolve. Genghis didn't rely on endless troops. He relied on speed, strategy, and the certainty that once he committed to your destruction, there would be no loopholes, no mercy, no parley. Cities tried to adapt. They dug deeper wells, stockpiled food, reinforced walls. But no amount of brick or grain could stop what was coming. The Mongols didn't need to outlast you. They only needed to break you. Sometimes they waited weeks, sometimes months, but always, the end was the same. And when the killing was done, they didn't stay. They left ashes, bones, silence. They turned back toward the steppe, like a wave receding into the sea, leaving behind wreckage that couldn't be rebuilt. Entire cities vanished from the map, not merely conquered but unmade. Places with libraries, universities, gardens, and marketplaces simply stopped existing. This wasn't slaughter for slaughter's sake. It was a doctrine, a campaign of horror so effective that future cities would collapse under the weight of memory alone. Genghis Khan understood that conquest wasn't just a matter of fighting, Conquest was storytelling, and the stories he left behind weren't written in ink. They were carved into the skulls of the fallen and whispered into the ears of trembling survivors. How do you kill a city? You surround it in silence. You offer a chance. You punish the answer. You turn its bones into warnings. You rip its name from the wind. And when you leave nothing. Only the lesson. 40 million. It's a number so large it collapses under its own weight. Bigger than empires, louder than screams, more enduring than monuments. 40 million souls extinguished under the hooves of Mongol horses, cut down by curved blades, buried in mass graves, forgotten in deserts and riverbeds. It's a number etched into the legacy of Genghis Khan, like blood into stone. The number comes not from the Mongols themselves, who rarely bothered to record the bodies they left behind, but from those who survived, or claimed to: Persian historians, Arab chroniclers, Chinese officials, and later European observers pieced together tales of annihilation that made entire cities vanish from the map. The 13th century Persian scholar, Juvaini, wrote of 1.7 million killed at Nishapur. Others claimed that Merv saw 700 perish. Samarkand, Herat, Baghdad, each attached to 6-digit death tolls, often in neat, rounded figures, as if the act of counting could somehow make sense of the slaughter. But these numbers were as much rhetoric as record. Chroniclers were not statisticians. They wrote in awe, in horror, in warning. Inflated numbers made for powerful storytelling. If your city survived, you emphasized the scale of destruction elsewhere to highlight your own narrow escape. If your city fell, you exaggerated the loss to honor the dead and curse the killers. And yet, beneath the hyperbole, something cold and undeniable persists. The destruction was real. Maybe not 40 million real, but certainly tens of millions changed, ended, or erased. Modern historians, with access to archaeology, demography, and population modeling, have tried to make sense of it. One method involves measuring depopulation. China's population dropped by tens of millions during the Mongol conquests. Some of that can be attributed to war, but much more to famine, plague, and systemic collapse. When irrigation systems failed, when trade routes choked, when villages fled into the mountains, people didn't just die, they vanished from records. Others look at the density of mass graves. In Central Asia, layers of scorched earth and collapsed structures point to deliberate, widespread destruction. Mongol warfare didn't always aim to kill everyone, but when a city resisted or broke a treaty, the punishment was absolute. The phrase, "leave no stone standing," became policy, and stone can be counted. But even the most precise models run into the fog of the past. What does it mean to say someone died because of Genghis Khan? Is it the arrow that killed the soldier, the starvation that followed a scorched harvest, the orphan whose parents never returned? Death doesn't always arrive in the form of a blade. Sometimes it's the plague that sweeps through refugee camps, the despair that drives suicide, the winter that kills the displaced. What's clear is that the Mongol conquests created a demographic vacuum. Entire regions, northern China, Central Asia, Persia, experienced population crashes that took generations to recover. In some places, they never did. Cities like Nishapur, once centers of learning and culture, became whispers in dust. Agricultural systems crumbled. Trade networks collapsed. The death toll wasn't just in lives lost, but in futures stolen. Yet for all the devastation, there was also structure. Genghis Khan kept census records not of the dead, but of the living. He needed to know how many men he could conscript, how many craftsmen he could relocate, how many horses needed feeding. The Mongol Empire thrived on numbers. Population counts, tribute tallies, quotas for labour and soldiers. But these records only counted those within the empire. The dead were uncounted, unneeded, irrelevant. And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing. The Mongols didn't kill for pleasure, but for policy. Mass death wasn't a byproduct. It was a function. A disobedient city was an inefficiency to be corrected. A rebellious population was a future threat to be neutralized. Genocide was not emotional, it was logistical. And that mindset, more than any specific number, is what makes the 40 million figure feel so chillingly plausible. There's also the problem of echo. Once chroniclers began citing massive death tolls, later writers repeated them, sometimes multiplying them. The myth of the Mongol terror grew with each retelling. Genghis Khan became not just a conqueror, but a human extinction event. And that's where history blurs into legend. The numbers, whether 40 million or 4 million, cease to be data points. They become symbols. But even symbols have power. They ask us to imagine loss on a scale beyond comprehension, to walk through cities silenced in a week, to picture rivers choked with corpses, to understand that some wars do not end when the fighting stops, they end when there is no one left to tell the story. So did Genghis Khan really kill 40 million people? It depends how you count, and it depends why you're asking. But this much is certain. When he rode, the world changed, and millions, whether 40 or 14, did not live to see what came after. When the Mongols passed, the silence stayed. The sound of footsteps vanished from market streets. The smoke of morning fires no longer curled above rooftops. Wells dried up, not from drought, but from disuse. Fields lay flat and empty, wheat replaced by weeds, orchards withered into thorn. For centuries, cities had been the engines of civilization, centers of trade, religion, learning, and law. Then came Genghis Khan, and in his wake, an entire world blinked out. Nishapur, Merv, Urgench, Herat, cities that once shimmered with domes and minarets, whose libraries rivaled Alexandria, whose bazaars overflowed with silks, spices, and the tongues of a dozen nations gone. Not conquered, not rebuilt, just erased. The walls were pulled down, the streets soaked in blood. The survivors marched off or burned where they stood. The Mongols weren't interested in occupation. They didn't want tribute from rebels. They wanted no rebels left. When a city resisted, it wasn't defeated, it was unmade. And what happens when a city disappears? Trade routes die. The veins that connect regions, camel trains, river ports. Merchant ships dry up. Farmers who once sold grain to urban markets now have no buyers. Artisans lose their patrons. Scribes lose their readers. The fabric of an entire regional economy, woven over generations, unravels in months. The death of a city sends shockwaves outward, far beyond its walls. Kill one, and 10 villages collapse beside it. The Mongols, for all their military brilliance, had no interest in maintaining the cities they razed, at least not initially. They didn't govern in the traditional sense. Their rule came on horseback, fast and final. Urban bureaucracy, temple hierarchies, merchant guilds, these were tools of a different world. In the early years, Genghis Khan saw cities as either threats or resources. If they resisted, they were destroyed. If they surrendered, their skilled workers were relocated. Either way, the city itself ceased to be a living thing. Irrigation systems, once meticulously maintained by generations of engineers and farmers, were left to decay. The qanats of Persia, the canals of Central Asia, the rice paddies of northern China, these were fragile networks that required constant upkeep. With no labour force left and no administrators to organise repair, they collapsed. Salinization ruined the soil. Floods destroyed terraces. Fertile farmland reverted to wasteland. In some regions, the impact was so severe that the land has never recovered. Parts of the Khwarezmian Empire, once dotted with dense population centres and agricultural grids, became desert within a generation. The demographic collapse was more than just bodies. It was infrastructure, it was memory. It was a landscape that forgot how to feed itself. And then there was the knowledge. When Merv fell, it was said to have housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, scientific treatises, philosophical texts, poetry, medicine, astronomy, legal codes. When Baghdad burned in 1258 at the hands of Genghis's grandson Hulagu, the Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink and red with blood. Scholars killed, libraries incinerated, institutions wiped out. It wasn't just people who died, it was continuity. In a world without cities, education halts. Children have no schools, elders have no forums, ideas have no stage. Oral traditions die when there are no ears to hear. Written ones rot when there are no hands to copy them. And with every unwritten thought, with every unsung song, the world becomes a little dimmer. Population maps from the 13th and 14th centuries show entire swaths of Central Asia and northern China experiencing catastrophic declines. These weren't just the casualties of war, but the aftershocks of devastation. The Mongol conquest didn't just take life. It stole the conditions in which life could grow back. Disease followed famine. Famine followed disruption. Communities fragmented. Survivors fled to mountains, forests, or foreign cities, becoming exiles in lands that spoke different tongues. What emerged wasn't a new civilization, but a vacuum, a stillness that lasted for decades. Travellers wrote of vast, empty stretches where once thriving cities had stood, roads once guarded by customs officials and shaded by caravanserais now stretched naked beneath the sky. No tolls, no banners, no law, and yet, in time, the Mongols began to understand what they had broken. The later Khans shifted strategy. Cities that surrendered were spared. Craftsmen were preserved. Chinese engineers, Persian scribes, Arab astronomers, they were moved across the empire, like pieces on a board. A new imperial infrastructure rose, centered not on individual cities, but on the movement between them. Postal routes, relay stations, census taking, the beginnings of order. But it would take generations to replant what had been uprooted, because a city isn't just buildings and people. It's a rhythm, a conversation across centuries, a delicate dance between water and stone, labour and language. Genghis Khan didn't just kill cities, he killed time. He snapped the thread of continuity, forcing entire cultures to begin again, from scratch or from exile. What remains now are ruins, crumbled walls buried beneath sand, broken pottery shards baked under sun, and stories. Always stories of cities that glittered once, and then were gone, of towers turned to bone, of streets that once echoed with footsteps, now silent forever. In the empire of Genghis Khan, the future was built on the graves of cities, and the wind still remembers their names. China did not fall with a single stroke. It cracked in stages, like a frozen river under mounting weight. Beneath the banners of Genghis Khan and his heirs, the Mongols didn't simply invade China, they dismantled it. Dynasty by dynasty, brick by burning brick. It began with Western Xia, a borderland empire nestled between the Gobi Sands and the Chinese heartland, and ended with the Jin, rulers of a splintered northern China, gasping their last beneath the storm of horse and fire. Western Xia was first, not because it was the most dangerous, but because it was in the way. The Tangut rulers, confident behind their desert fortresses and mountain passes, underestimated the fury of the steppe. When Genghis demanded submission and tribute, they hesitated. They had seen nomadic incursions before and survived. But they had never seen Mongols. In 1209, he marched into their world with a force that didn't just fight battles, it swallowed space. The campaign was a brutal education. Cities like Yinchuan were besieged and bombarded with Chinese-engineered siege weapons, turned against their makers. Wells were poisoned, crops burned. The Mongols used floodwater as a weapon, diverting rivers into fortresses. Resistance was punished with extermination. Eventually, the Western Shah surrendered reluctantly, partially, falsely. Genghis accepted it at first, extracting tribute and hostages. But trust was a currency he didn't carry. When the Shia later withheld troops during Genghis's campaign against the Khwarezmians, they signed their own death sentence. In 1226, he returned not to negotiate, but to erase. This time, the Mongols didn't bother with treaties. Town by town, they cut the empire down to the root. The capital fell after a savage siege, and the last emperor, a defiant relic of sand and pride, was killed with his entire court. The Mongols turned the region to silence. Western Shia ceased to exist. Its records, temples, and people smothered in ash and blood. But the real dragon was the Jin. The Jurchen-led Jin dynasty ruled northern China with an iron grip and a Chinese court's grandeur. They had armies, cities, engineers, and walls that stretched for hundreds of miles. They had fought off the Song, battled the Khitans, and believed themselves unbreakable. What they didn't have was Mongol fury. Not yet. In 1211, that changed. Genghis brought an army of over 100 across the Great Wall, not to test Jin defences, but to shatter them. The initial campaign saw lightning raids and open-field massacres. Jin armies were crushed under the speed and precision of Mongol cavalry. Cities fell in days. Some defected, others resisted, and were punished with population-wide executions. But the Jin, though wounded, survived. Their capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was encircled, starved, and burned. Reports say the smell of rot carried for miles, but it wasn't the end. The Jin moved their capital south to Kaifeng and fought on. For the next 2 decades, the Mongols tightened their grip. They used captured Chinese and Khitan engineers to build siege engines that could collapse walls like paper. They diverted rivers to flood cities. They sowed chaos by encouraging rebellion, backing internal Jin rivals, and bribing border generals. It wasn't just a war of swords. It was a war of betrayal, starvation, and despair. Genghis died in 1227, but his sons continued the campaign like a religion. Ogedei, his third son and chosen successor, launched renewed invasions. The Mongols learned from every siege, improving their war machines and refining their cruelty. The Jin, by now bled dry from famine and revolt, began to implode. City after city was burned. The peasantry starved, slaughtered, or conscripted. Walls were torn down not just to conquer, but to prevent rebuilding. It wasn't conquest, it was strangulation. In 1232, Kaifeng came under siege. The Jin emperor appealed desperately to the southern Song for aid, but none came. The Mongols unleashed a barrage of siege fire and, more horrifically, the first recorded use of gunpowder bombs against a major city. The sky exploded in flame. Arrows turned to smoke. The walls fell, and the city with it. The emperor fled. The court dissolved. By 1234, the Jin dynasty was gone, and in its place, only ruin. What made the conquest so devastating wasn't just the bloodshed, it was the methodical disassembly of everything the Jin had built. Roads were broken, canals destroyed, administrators killed. The Mongols didn't want to govern a Jin empire. They wanted no Jin empire left. Where Western Xia was annihilated as a warning, the Jin were destroyed to clear the path into the deeper heart of China. But the cost was catastrophic. Entire provinces lost half their population. Agricultural zones collapsed. Cultural centers were turned to embers. Jin China had been an engine of art, scholarship, and bureaucracy. After the Mongols, it was a fractured husk, and still, the conquest was not complete. The southern song remained, battered but whole, watching the north burn and wondering when the fire would come for them. China, for all its walls and dynasties, had been breached. Genghis Khan never lived to see its full conquest. But he broke the lock, and his descendants would pry the door wide open. The dragon didn't fall in a single blow. It bled, burned, and shattered in stages, and the Mongols carved their name into each scar. The sword silenced millions, but it also made space. Where villages once teemed, where cities once thrived, where dynasties once rooted generations into the soil, there was emptiness, a demographic void left behind by the firestorm of Mongol conquest. Into that void rode the descendants of Genghis Khan, not just on horseback, but in blood. Long after the cries of the dying faded, long after the banners of the empire were folded into dust, the great Khan's legacy continued not in stone or scroll, but in chromosomes. In 2003, a team of geneticists revealed a startling truth. Nearly 1 in 200 men alive today, over 16 million at the time of the study, carry a Y chromosome traceable to a single male ancestor who lived in the Mongolian steppe about 800 years ago. The conclusion was simple, stunning, and chilling. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer empires. He rewrote the genetic script of humanity. How does a man's DNA survive and spread so widely, for so long? The answer begins with elimination. The Mongol invasions wiped out countless family lines. In places like Central Asia, Persia, northern China, and the Caucasus, noble houses were decapitated, tribal elders executed, entire male populations systematically culled after sieges. Cities were reduced to ash, and with them, the genealogies of their people. In war, death is random. Under the Mongols, it was selective. Rebellion was punished by annihilating not just armies, but lineages. At the same time, the conquerors imposed their own order, captured women, particularly those from aristocratic bloodlines, were taken as wives or concubines, not merely as spoils, but as instruments of power. Genghis Khan himself had dozens of such unions. Many arranged for political consolidation, others born of conquest. His sons, grandsons, and generals inherited not only command of armies, but access to the highest ranks of captive society. Their progeny was scattered like seed across a continent in upheaval. In traditional steppe culture, lineage meant everything. The bloodline of the Borjigin clan, Genghis's own, was exalted. Marriage alliances were strategic. Offspring tracked with care. When the Mongol Empire fractured into khanates, each branch still traced its legitimacy back to the same source, the man once known as Temujin. To rule was to carry his name, and carrying his name often meant carrying his genes. Unlike European monarchies, where succession passed narrowly and bloodlines were tightly curated, the Mongol elite spread broadly. A Khan might have dozens of children, each with different mothers, stationed across different corners of the empire. These children, in turn, produced more princes, generals, governors, Over generations, this expansive reproductive tree blurred the lines between dynasty and population. But Genghis's genetic shadow wasn't confined to palaces. His descendants intermarried with local nobility from Baghdad to Beijing, Samarkand to Siberia. And because the Mongols often elevated sons of noble or military lineage into local power, their DNA embedded itself not just in imperial courts, but in the merchant classes, the officer corps, and even among the clergy. Over time, Genghis Khan's blood flowed not just through kings, but through farmers, traders, and shepherds. The post-conquest population collapse accelerated this process. With so many local male lines broken, the descendants of the Mongols filled the vacuum. Their children inherited lands, titles, and fertile soil. In places where once 100 families might have vied for power, now one ruled alone and fathered many. Today, the genetic echo can be found most strongly in regions once under direct Mongol control. Mongolia, of course, but also Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, parts of Western China, and southern Russia. In each case, a distinctive marker on the Y chromosome haplotype C3, whispers of an ancestor who rode out of the steppe and left a legacy not of scrolls or ruins, but of skin and bone. This is not a triumph. It is not a celebration of virility. It is the anatomy of empire. For every strand of Genghis's DNA that survived, countless others were extinguished. Entire bloodlines, thousands of years old, ended in siege fires and river drownings. His genetic dominance is not proof of greatness. It is proof of what's left when all other options are burned away. But it is real. It lives on. In a world where empires crumble and names are forgotten, Genghis Khan remains in the bloodstream. Every time one of his genetic descendants draws breath, a fragment of the man who reshaped continents continues onward. He did not just conquer the world in his lifetime. He buried his name in the future, long after the bones have turned to dust, after the cities are ruins, after the chronicles fade to myth. The body remembers. And it remembers him. Baghdad had once been the crown of the world, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. Its libraries brimmed with the collected brilliance of centuries' astronomy, medicine, mathematics, poetry, theology. Its gardens were spoken of in distant lands. The House of Wisdom stood not just as a building, but as a symbol of inquiry, of memory, of humanity reaching for the divine through reason. And in 1258, the Mongols came, not with questions, but with fire. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, had been tasked with completing a campaign his ancestors never finished, the utter subjugation of the Islamic heartlands. By the time his armies reached Baghdad, they had already consumed Persia, Armenia, parts of Mesopotamia. They moved like a tide that drowned kingdoms. And yet Baghdad still stood, radiant and proud, guarded by centuries of belief that it was too important, too holy, too civilized to fall. It was not. The Caliph al-Mustasim, heir to a weakened and fractious line, had misjudged everything. He believed his city invincible behind its walls. He believed Islam's sacred status would protect it. He believed diplomacy could delay the inevitable. He was wrong. When he refused Hulagu's demand for submission, the Mongol war engine responded with the only language it spoke fluently: total war. In January 1258, Hulagu's forces surrounded the city. Estimates place the Mongol army at around 150, a vast multinational force, including not only Mongols, but also Chinese engineers, Turkic auxiliaries, and Christian vassals from Armenia and Georgia. They constructed siege works with terrifying efficiency. They dammed the Tigris, used mangonels to hurl massive projectiles, and mined beneath the walls. In less than 2 weeks, Baghdad's outer defences crumbled. The gates broke, and the slaughter began. The numbers, as always with Mongol conquest, blur into the language of horror. Contemporary accounts speak of 200 dead. Others claim over 1 million. Even conservative historians agree. The death toll was in the hundreds of thousands. Entire districts were methodically emptied of life. Men, women, children, no distinction. The Mongols killed with precision and contempt, burning palaces, mosques, markets, and homes. And then they turned to the libraries. The House of Wisdom, perhaps the greatest repository of human knowledge in the medieval world, was destroyed. Its books were torn apart, their pages used for kindling or tossed into the river. Legend says the Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood. Scrolls that had survived centuries of copying, translation, and debate vanished in days. With them went ideas, theoretical breakthroughs, histories of vanished peoples, philosophical arguments no one would ever read, again gone. The Mongols did not value paper. They valued obedience. The Caliph himself was captured. Hulagu, unlike some of his predecessors, did not slaughter rulers recklessly. He wanted a message. Al-Mustasim, last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses so that his blood would not touch the earth, out of superstition. With his death, the Abbasid line in Baghdad ended. So did an era. Baghdad was not just a capital, it was the soul of Islamic civilization. Its fall was not the loss of a city, it was the end of a worldview. In the centuries before the siege, Baghdad had been a beacon of cosmopolitanism. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Zoroastrians, and others debated in its halls. It produced polymaths like Al-Khwarizmi and Avicenna. It linked the East to the West through trade and scholarship, and in a matter of days, that network collapsed. The survivors, those who managed to hide, flee, or were spared, emerged to find a corpse of a city. Entire neighborhoods had been incinerated. The infrastructure of water, law, and learning lay in ruins. The canals were choked with debris, and the dead, commerce stopped, administration ceased, and with them, stability. Baghdad would never again reclaim its former glory. For the Islamic world, the sack of Baghdad was more than a military defeat. It was a wound to the soul. It shattered the illusion of divine protection. It marked the end of the classical Islamic Golden Age. The ulama and poets who survived wrote of it in tones of mourning and fury, trying to make sense of how a city so central to their faith and intellect could be abandoned by history so brutally. And yet, the Mongols did not linger. Hulagu moved on, deeper into Syria, until the tides of fate caught up with him at Ain Jalut. But by then, the damage was done. Baghdad was no longer the heart of the world, it was its cautionary tale. In time, the city would be rebuilt, under different rulers, bearing different names and ambitions. But the Baghdad that was the Baghdad of golden domes and ink-stained scholars, of philosophical debates that stretched into the stars, that Baghdad died in 1258, and as the smoke rose from the river, and the ink bled into the water, the world turned a page it could never retrieve. In the spring of 1241, the earth trembled beneath the hooves of a new kind of terror. Across the flat plains of Hungary and the frozen rivers of Poland, a force unlike anything Europe had ever known descended from the east, swift, surgical, and merciless. The Mongols had come, and with them came a question that still haunts the pages of history. What if they hadn't stopped? At the time, most of Christian Europe was still recovering from internal feuds and crusader exhaustion. Kings squabbled, popes schemed, and knights trained to fight each other. not the storm that now approached from the steppes. When the Mongols entered Poland and Hungary, they weren't just launching a raid, they were testing the boundaries of the world. And they found them wanting. The invasion was a masterclass in coordination. Under the overall command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, and the brilliant general Subutai, the Mongol campaign split into several columns. One attacked Poland, sweeping through Krakow, burning Wrocław, and annihilating a joint force of European knights at the Battle of Legnica. The other surged into Hungary, where King Bela IV attempted to rally a defensive stand. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed. They crossed frozen rivers as if they were roads, used Chinese and Persian engineers to breach city walls, and feigned retreats to lure enemies into killing fields. At Legnica, Mongol forces decapitated Duke Henry II of Silesia and displayed his head on a spear to shatter morale. In Hungary, they overwhelmed fortified towns with siege engines, psychological warfare, and fire. Pest was raised. The countryside was devastated. Survivors fled into mountains or perished on the roads. But it was at the Battle of Mohi, on April 11, 1241, that the fate of Hungary, and perhaps all of Europe, was sealed. The Hungarian army, large and well positioned along the Saho River, was trapped in a deadly pincer. Subutai executed a flanking maneuver so precise it reads like fiction. Bridges were destroyed to isolate, escape, and fires were lit behind the enemy to blind and confuse. By the end of the day, tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers lay dead. Bela barely escaped with his life. Hungary had no army left. The road to Vienna, Prague, and beyond lay open. And then, without warning, the Mongols stopped. In December 1241, word reached Batu Khan. The great Khan Urgedei was dead. As was Mongol custom, all princes of royal blood were summoned to the Mongolian heartland to elect a new supreme leader. Batu halted the advance. His generals protested. Subutai, it said, had mapped out the march to the Adriatic, but the rules of succession were iron. They turned back. Europe had been seconds from decapitation. No standing force remained to stop the Mongols. Had they continued into the German principalities, France, or the Italian city-states, Constantinople, weakened and divided, would have been vulnerable. Even Rome, politically powerful but militarily hollow, might have fallen. The Mongols had already proven they could defeat heavy cavalry, outmaneuver stone castles, and terrorize entire populations into surrender. There was no reason to believe the kingdoms of Europe would fare any better than the Khwarezmians, the Jin, or Baghdad. But history hinges on deaths. Ogedai's passing froze the advance, and by the time the Mongol princes finished arguing over his successor, the opportunity had passed. Europe had rebuilt some defences. The climate had shifted. Internal Mongol politics turned towards civil war. The moment was lost. Still, the trauma remained. Across Christendom, the Mongol invasions became legend. Chroniclers described them as the apocalyptic horsemen of revelation. Priests called for prayer. Fortifications were expanded. New alliances formed not against each other, but against the next invasion that never came. And yet, the memory lingered like a nightmare that feels too real to dismiss. What if Batu hadn't turned back? What if Subutai had crossed the Danube? What if the Mongols had reached Paris, London, or Rome? Would Western civilization, as we know it, have been rewritten in the bloodied script of the steppes? Europe shivered because it saw the future and narrowly escaped it, not through strategy or strength or diplomacy, but because death came for someone else first. The Mongols didn't just conquer cities, they conquered minds, long before their horses crossed a kingdom's border. Stories galloped ahead, tales of cities reduced to bone, of towers built from severed heads. of rivers turned red, and mothers speared with their children still clinging to them. These weren't exaggerations. They were part of the plan. Genghis Khan understood something that generals and kings often forgot. Fear is a weapon sharper than any blade. When deployed correctly, it can do what 10,000 archers cannot. It can make the enemy surrender before the first arrow is loosed. The Mongols didn't just kill. They killed with choreography, they staged massacres, they made spectacles. And they made sure survivors fled not into hiding, but into other cities, into other kingdoms, carrying horror with them like a contagion. Terror was not incidental, it was policy. The Mongols developed this strategy early. When they razed the Khwarezmian city of Nishapur in 1221, they didn't just sack it. After a Mongol commander was killed, possibly a son-in-law of Genghis, the army responded by annihilating the population. Men, women, children, animals, everything alive was put to death. Some reports claim over 100, 0 were executed. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about message. Defy us, and you will be erased. Merv, another city in Central Asia, met a similar fate. After surrendering and then allegedly plotting rebellion, it was repopulated by silence. The Mongols separated the civilians into groups and killed them systematically. Chroniclers claim the city lost over 700 people, though the numbers blur into metaphor. What matters is that the survivors in nearby cities didn't resist. They opened their gates. They offered gifts. And when the Mongols left, they whispered the stories to the next town. Terror was efficient. By inflicting maximum psychological damage in key locations, the Mongols avoided long sieges, costly battles, and prolonged occupation. Cities that resisted were made into warnings. Cities that submitted were often spared. The choice was clear: open the gates, or join the list of vanished civilizations. But there was a deeper genius at play. Genghis and his generals knew the limits of their manpower. Even at its height, the Mongol Empire was stretched across continents, from the Pacific to the Caspian. They couldn't garrison every city, couldn't patrol every road. What they could do was create a reputation so terrifying, so universal, that most places didn't need soldiers to keep them in line. The memory of what had happened to others would be enough. This policy of terror wasn't sloppy, it was highly organized. Mongol envoys would deliver ultimatums: surrender and pay tribute, or perish. If accepted, the city would be integrated, taxed, and sometimes even protected. If rejected, the Mongols returned in force. They often allowed a few survivors to escape on purpose, to spread news of what had happened. The terror wasn't just in the death. It was in the knowledge that death was coming. Even the methods of killing were part of the message. In some cities, the Mongols executed captives outside the walls, so other cities could see the smoke and hear the screams. In others, they built pyramids of skulls, methodically arranged to mark the place where a culture used to be. In Baghdad, they destroyed not only people, but memory, burning libraries, temples, records. They didn't just want obedience, they wanted amnesia. But the horror wasn't always delivered with fire and blade. Sometimes it was in silence. A city would be found empty, its streets clean, its markets abandoned. No signs of struggle. Just the knowledge that its people had vanished. That, too, was a kind of terror, the sense that resistance didn't even result in martyrdom, just deletion. Of course, the Mongols weren't the first to use fear in war, but they elevated it into an art form. They fused it with mobility, discipline, and propaganda. They ensured their enemies knew not only that they could destroy them, but that they would, without hesitation and without mercy. This strategy fractured alliances before battles even began. Rival cities, fearing the Mongols more than they hated each other, betrayed their neighbours for survival. Walled cities with rich garrisons crumbled at the whisper of hooves on the wind. The Mongols didn't need spies when they had trauma doing their reconnaissance. And yet, they could also be strangely merciful, selectively, surgically. A city that surrendered in time might be left untouched. Artisans were often spared. Engineers were brought into the Mongol service. Merchants were encouraged. This wasn't inconsistency, it was control. Mercy, too, became a tool, a dual edge. Submit and live richly, resist and die screaming. In the end, the empire Genghis Khan built was not held together by walls or treaties, but by stories. Stories of what happened when the Mongols came, of what happened when they were refused, of what remained after they left, and long after the horses died, after the blood washed away, after the ash blew into the steppe. Those stories remained. Because that's the thing about terror, it outlives everything. The fire Genghis Khan lit did not flicker when he died. It roared louder. What he built was not a fleeting empire of conquest, but an engine of devastation that kept moving long after his ashes returned to the steppe. His sons and grandsons inherited more than territory. They inherited a doctrine, a blueprint of annihilation sharpened to a science. Across mountains and jungles, deserts and deltas, they carried the flame, and the world, from Korea to Syria, watched it burn. Subutai was not born to royalty. He was not a Khan, nor a prince, but he was a master of war, perhaps the greatest general the Mongols ever produced. Under his command, the empire's grip tightened on Eastern Europe and the Near East. His campaigns were feats of logistical genius, traversing thousands of kilometers in months, coordinating multiple armies like fingers of the same hand. In Hungary, Poland, and the Rus principalities, he left a trail of ash and shattered kingdoms. But his was only one front. To the east, Kublai Khan, the ambitious grandson of Genghis, focused on China. The conquest of the southern Song was a slow, grinding war. Unlike the lightning strikes of his ancestors, China, vast and ancient, resisted fiercely. The Mongols adapted. They built navies. They learned siegecraft from Persian and Chinese engineers. They flooded cities and burned granaries. They starved millions. It was not war in the old Mongol style. It was war as occupation, as transformation. Kublai sought not just submission, but supremacy. He wanted not tribute, but a throne, and he took it. When Hangzhou, the Song capital, finally fell in 1276, the death toll wasn't measured just in bodies, but in eras. The city surrendered, sparing some lives, but the countryside bled for years afterward. Refugees drowned by the thousands as they fled south by boat. Pockets of resistance were crushed with ruthless precision. The Southern Song, one of the most culturally vibrant dynasties in Chinese history, ceased to exist, and in its place, the Yuan dynasty was born, Mongol at its peak, Chinese in appearance. But the fire didn't stop in China. Korea, caught between great powers, had already tasted Mongol wrath during repeated invasions. After initial resistance, the Korean Goryeo dynasty capitulated, marrying into the Mongol line and becoming a vassal. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands dead, cities burned, and a generation of Korean youth taken as hostages and concubines. Goryeo bent, survived, and paid tribute for a century. To the south, Kublai looked toward Japan. In 1274, and again in 1281, the Mongols launched seaborne invasions. The First Fleet was ravaged by storms. the second obliterated by what the Japanese would call the kamikaze, the divine wind. But even in failure, the campaigns showed the ambition of Mongol power. They did not see oceans as barriers. They saw them as roads yet to be travelled. Vietnam suffered differently. The jungle resisted in ways that men could not. The Mongols invaded multiple times, and though they captured cities and executed kings, they struggled against heat, disease, and guerrilla tactics. Vietnamese forces, knowing the terrain, struck with precision, then vanished. Still, each Mongol campaign left villages burned, rice stores looted, and entire populations uprooted. In the west, the Ilkhanate, another branch of Genghis's legacy, extended into Persia and the Middle East. Under Hulagu Khan, Baghdad had been erased. But the campaigns continued. Syria became the next prize. In 1260, Mongol forces swept into Aleppo and Damascus. Mosques were desecrated. Markets were emptied of life. Yet at Ain Jalut, in Palestine, something changed. The Mamluks of Egypt, disciplined and mounted on powerful war horses, defeated the Mongols in open battle for the first time. The myth cracked, but the fire still smouldered. After Hulagu, his successors kept pushing into Anatolia, crushing the Seljuks and reducing Armenian and Georgian kingdoms to shadows. The Caucasus became a zone of perpetual ruin. Armenia's great monasteries were looted, its hilltop towns scorched. Georgian chronicles of the time read like funeral dirges. And everywhere the Mongols went, they didn't just kill, they dismantled. Systems of government, irrigation networks, libraries, and languages. Whole cultures weren't just broken, they were emptied out. And yet, the Mongols were not mindless destroyers. They taxed, they built postal routes, they encouraged trade along the Silk Road, they allowed multiple religions to flourish, often side by side. But all of that came after the flame. Only once resistance had been burned away, once bones were buried under collapsed gates, once the message was made clear. The numbers are impossible to confirm, but in the century following Genghis's rise, it is estimated that up to 40 million people perished as a result of Mongol wars, famines, reprisals, and population collapse. 40 million. A figure so large it bleeds into abstraction. A death toll stitched not just from conquest, but from policy, from intention, from repetition. Each successor added their own layer. Subutai with his brilliant cruelty, Kublai with his imperial ambition, Hulagu with his theological annihilation. They carried the vision forward, one city, one culture at a time, and long after their reigns ended, their legacy endured, in ghost towns across Asia, in the forgotten names of rivers once choked with the dead, in the broken lineage of families that never got to become ancestors. Because the fire Genghis Khan lit was not meant to flicker, it was meant to spread. The Mongols didn't just unite empires, they unwittingly united pathogens. Their conquests stitched together the vast and scattered lands of Eurasia into a single, pulsing artery of movement, of goods, ideas, people, and death. Along the dirt tracks of the Silk Road, where silk once whispered and spices changed hands, something darker began to stir, and by the mid-14th century, it would ride the same routes the Mongols had carved out with blood and iron, bringing with it a silence more complete than any sword could deliver. The Silk Road before Genghis Khan had been a fragmented network, disconnected, dangerous, sporadic. Merchants travelled in fear of bandits, bribes, and warlords. Goods moved slowly and information slower still. But under Mongol rule, something extraordinary happened. Order. The Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, didn't mean safety in the moral sense, but in the practical one. The Mongols eliminated threats along the trade routes with brutal efficiency. Bandits were executed. Passports and relay stations were established. Roads were repaired. Bridges built. A merchant could now travel from the Yellow River to the Danube without ever leaving Mongol-controlled territory. Trade flourished. Gold and porcelain, carpets and gunpowder. Persian scholars debated with Chinese alchemists. Arab doctors read Indian manuscripts. It was an age of connection, forced into being by an empire that knew the value of movement. The Silk Road was not a road, it was a bloodstream. And into that bloodstream entered something microscopic, invisible, and patient. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, had long lurked in rodent populations across Central Asia, particularly in marmots. For centuries, it had caused localized outbreaks. But when the Mongols opened up trade routes, accelerated contact between distant regions, increased urbanization, and moved people, livestock, and grain across continents, it also gave the bacterium a new playground. Fleas found new hosts, rats found new ships, and the plague found a highway. By the 1330s, it began to spread in earnest. First in the steppes of Central Asia, then into China, where records from the Yuan dynasty speak of strange illnesses, high fevers, and death in the tens of millions. From there, it moved west. Mongol caravans and merchant ships carried infected rodents and fleas along the Silk Road and its maritime extensions. When the Black Death finally reached Crimea in the 1340s, the Mongols were already laying siege to the Genoese port city of Kaffa. Here, history takes a grim turn. Some accounts claim that the Mongols, seeing their own troops die of plague, turned the dead into weapons, catapulting infected corpses over the city walls. Whether true or embellished, what followed was certain. Italian merchants fled Kaffa by sea, heading back to Constantinople, Genoa, and Venice. They brought goods, news, and death. The plague exploded across Europe like a fuse reaching powder. From 1347 to 1351, it killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, up to half the continent. Towns were emptied. Entire families vanished overnight. Priests died in the streets. Graveyards overflowed. In Paris, the dead were dumped into mass pits. In England, the population shrank by a third. In Cairo, thousands died in a single day. And always, the stories travelled with it. A merchant from Tana, a sailor from Messina, a caravan out of Samarkand. None of this was intentional. The Mongols didn't create the plague, but they created the conditions for it to spread like never before. Their genius for logistics, their appetite for movement, their creation of a globalized medieval world, it all became the scaffold for one of the greatest biological disasters in human history. It was a side effect of connectivity. What Genghis Khan had begun with arrows, the plague finished with silence. And it wasn't just death that travelled the road. The collapse of cities and the trauma of population loss rewired economies and political systems. Labour shortages led to peasant revolts and shifts in power. Faith was tested. Art became darker, more desperate. The world had been tied together, and now it suffered together. This is the paradox of empire. The same system that allows a Persian physician to treat a Chinese merchant also allows a disease to cross mountains and seas. The same postal route that carries a letter from Karakoram to Baghdad can also carry a flea. Progress and peril are the same path, just walked at different times. The Mongols didn't know what they were carrying, but they knew what it meant to move fast, to collapse distance, and the plague moved in their shadow, silent and unseen, until it stepped out and claimed the world. The Silk Road glistened with gold. But beneath the silk and spice, something darker pulsed, a pathogen as hungry for expansion as the empire that unknowingly helped unleash it. And in the end, it may be that the truest legacy of Mongol conquest wasn't the cities razed or the borders redrawn, but the way it changed what it meant for a world to be connected, because once the plague came, it never really left. And neither did the roads. To resist the Mongols was not to gamble, it was to sign your own death warrant. Rebellion wasn't met with negotiation. It wasn't met with occupation. It was met with erasure. The Mongol answer to defiance was to make your name disappear, your language vanish, your city crumble into dust, and your people join the dead in silence. They didn't just punish rebels, they turned them into warnings. The system was brutally efficient. The Mongols offered a simple bargain: surrender and be spared, or resist and be extinguished. Some chose submission, and they survived, taxed, watched, sometimes even rewarded. But others, convinced that these foreign horsemen could be stopped, chose defiance. For them, history wrote a single sentence, and then it closed the book. Nishapur thought it could outmaneuver the Mongols after initial surrender. They were wrong. When a Mongol commander, possibly Genghis Khan's own son-in-law, was killed in a skirmish, the response was not proportional. It was apocalyptic. The city's population, by some accounts, was annihilated to the last. Tens of thousands slaughtered in assembly line fashion. The streets turned to mud with blood. The Mongols stacked the skulls in pyramids, counted the dead in silence, and left the bones to speak for them. Merv was worse. Once a jewel of Central Asia, its libraries rivaled Baghdad, its scholars revered. But when it resisted Mongol rule, some say through rumour alone, it ceased to exist. Captives were separated into groups: artisans, scholars, women, children, soldiers. One by one, they were led out and executed. Some chroniclers say over 700 perished, though numbers fade into poetry at that scale. What matters is that the city never recovered. Today, Merv is ruins in the desert, scattered stones where voices once echoed. Balkh, Ray, Herat, city after city thought they could delay or defy the tide. Each became a cautionary tale. The Mongols didn't distinguish between guilty and innocent, rebel and civilian. If a town stood in opposition, every inhabitant bore the cost. It wasn't personal, it was policy. Leave nothing behind. Make the next city remember. In Georgia, Queen Tamar's heirs tried to rally resistance in the Caucasus. Mongol forces responded with a campaign so thorough that entire regions were depopulated, churches burned, villages erased from maps. Survivors were dragged across the empire, resettled or enslaved. The Georgian chronicles of the time are filled with grief and fire. They do not speak of conquest, they speak of obliteration. Baghdad, long past the era of resistance, paid the price for a different kind of defiance: arrogance. When the Caliph refused to heed Hulagu Khan's demands, convinced that Islam's prestige would shield him, the Mongols came in 1258. The city fell in days. The House of Wisdom, heart of Islamic science and philosophy, was burned, its books thrown into the Tigris, staining the river black with ink. The massacre lasted a week, hundreds of thousands dead, not because they resisted, but because they thought they couldn't fall. But the Mongols didn't only burn what stood against them, they marked it, made examples of it. In some cities, survivors were forced to build their own monuments of shame, pillars of heads, ditches of corpses, walls decorated with the bones of their neighbours. The Mongols turned execution into performance. Rebellion wasn't just punished, it was humiliated, and the cruelty wasn't always swift. Sometimes it was cold and slow. In a city called Urgench, resistance dragged on for weeks. When it finally fell, the Mongols were said to be so exhausted by the killing that they had to rotate in fresh troops to complete the slaughter. Survivors were sold into slavery across the empire. Their city, once a centre of wealth and learning, became a cursed name spoken by passing traders in hushed tones. Even natural barriers didn't protect rebellion. The mountain strongholds of the Alamut assassins, dug into the crags of Persia, were surrounded, starved, and stormed. The Mongols tore down their fortresses stone by stone, not because the assassins posed a future threat they were already in decline, but because they had dared defy. The lesson had to be clear. No cave too deep, no wall too high. This was psychological warfare at a civilizational scale. The Mongols understood that fear lasts longer than memory, that it passes faster than rumor, that one burning city can silence a dozen before the flames go out. Resistance wasn't just crushed, it was made obsolete. And yet, some still resisted. Armenians, Bulgars, Vietnamese, Mamluks, not all fell. Some survived by bending just enough, others through sheer geography or luck. But in the heartlands of Central Asia and Persia, resistance was a gamble few won. The Mongols had no tolerance for rebellion because they built their empire on the illusion that resistance was pointless. Every defiant city that was erased only reinforced that illusion. In the end, what's remembered isn't the act of rebellion, it's the price, the ash, the bones, the silence, and the names, so many names that were never spoken again. Because to defy the Mongols was to wager with extinction, and history is littered with the skulls of those who lost. When the Mongols conquered, they did not always kill. Sometimes they moved. Sometimes they scattered people like seeds flung across the wind, uprooting entire populations with the same ease they burned cities. But make no mistake, deportation was not mercy. It was another form of destruction. A quieter one, perhaps, but just as deadly. And just as permanent. The world Genghis Khan built was an empire of motion. Soldiers moved, messengers moved, ideas moved. And people, millions of them, were forced to move, whether they wanted to or not. Whole cities emptied of their inhabitants, marched across steppes and deserts to be resettled thousands of miles away. Craftsmen from China ended up in Bukhara. Persian doctors found themselves in Karakorum. Armenian scribes copied texts for Mongol princes in Mongolia. Slavic children served in the harems of Samarkand. Families torn apart. Communities broken down, languages lost in the churn. The goal was practical. The Mongols valued talent. They needed engineers to build siege weapons, metal workers to forge arrowheads, farmers to tame new lands, and scholars to advise their khans. Wherever the empire rolled, it harvested the useful. But usefulness didn't equal safety. Those taken were often marched under harsh conditions. Food was scarce, protection minimal, disease constant. Many died along the way, nameless and unburied. To be selected was to survive the massacre, but not necessarily the aftermath. This wasn't random, it was systematized. After a city fell, the population was divided like loot. The skilled and beautiful were spared for the empire. The strong were conscripted or enslaved. The elderly and infirm were killed. Sometimes they were left to starve. Sometimes they were beheaded on the spot. Survivors were branded, catalogued, and marched away. It was logistics at the edge of a knife. In Samarkand, after its capture, thousands of artisans were deported to Mongolia. These were the finest weavers, architects, and metal workers in Central Asia, sent to beautify the new Mongol capital or serve in the courts of the Khans. They built temples, minted coins, designed palaces, but they never saw their homes again. Their children grew up speaking foreign tongues. Their old gods were forgotten. In China, The conquest of the Jin and Song dynasties led to the forced relocation of hundreds of thousands. Many were sent northward, across the Great Wall, into the heart of the Steppe Empire. Some were used to repopulate cities destroyed by Mongol campaigns. Others were forced to intermarry, their identities blurred for good. The census takers would later record them not as exiles, but as citizens. But the line between integration and erasure was thin and often fatal. Baghdad was different. When it fell in 1258, many who survived the initial massacre were not spared for freedom. Scholars were enslaved to copy texts or serve as tutors. Artisans were shipped to distant cities to help build mosques, observatories, and towers for Mongol governors. But the soul of Baghdad, the tightly woven communities of merchants, imams, poets, and philosophers, was gone. The survivors lived, yes, but they lived in fragments. And then there were the children, captured young from cities and villages. They were absorbed into the empire's growing need for loyal servants and soldiers. Some became translators. Some were converted. Some were raised as Mongols in all but name. In this way, the Mongols diluted the cultures they had conquered, not just by scattering them, but by raising their offspring as something else entirely. A Persian boy might grow up in a Mongol barracks, praying to foreign gods, speaking a hybrid tongue, forgetting the names of his grandparents. This wasn't just about utility, it was about control. Moving populations broke up the chance for coordinated rebellion. It dissolved ethnic and religious solidarity. A deported community couldn't rise against the Khan. It was too busy surviving, too busy forgetting who it used to be. But not all deportation was above ground. Some were simply vanished. Cities emptied overnight. Villages disappeared. In some cases, chroniclers write of whole populations being resettled, only for no further record to exist. No lists, no graves, just silence. The empire's reach was such that even conquered peoples far from the steppe felt its pull. Armenians found themselves relocated to Persia. Syrians worked in the bureaucracies of Tabriz. Jews were deported to serve as tax collectors or treasurers. Sometimes valued, often resented. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, became a strange mosaic one, forged not by mixing cultures through exchange, but by smashing them and scattering the pieces. This was death by deportation, not always immediate, but profound. Death of language, death of heritage, death of continuity. A grandmother's lullaby lost, a holy site left behind to crumble, a surname erased from its village, generations born in exile, never knowing what was taken from them. And those who survived, who prospered even, did so not as themselves but as tools of the empire that had broken them. A legacy not just of conquest, but of quiet cultural genocide, done in the name of order, expansion, and utility. The Mongols didn't need everyone to die. They just needed no one to stay who they were. So they moved them, and the world shifted. The Mongols were not farmers. They did not tend orchards or irrigate fields. They were riders, born of open steppes and endless skies, and their empire moved on hooves, not harvests. So when they descended upon the lush, carefully cultivated heartlands of Central Asia and the Middle East, they didn't see a fragile, life-giving network of canals and terraces. They saw territory to be taken and cities to be broken, and when they were done, what had once been green became dust. This was not scorched earth in the tactical sense. It was scorched earth as afterthought, as collateral, as consequence. The Mongols didn't set out to rewrite ecosystems, but when cities burned, the aqueducts that fed them collapsed with the roofs. When engineers were slaughtered or deported, the knowledge of how to maintain centuries-old hydraulic systems vanished. And when terror ruled, farmers fled, fields turned fallow, Irrigation ditches cracked in the sun. Water, the soul of so many civilizations, simply stopped flowing. The greatest casualties were not soldiers or kings, but landscapes. Nowhere was this clearer than in the green belt, the swath of land stretching from the Iranian plateau through Mesopotamia to the edges of Anatolia and the Levant. It was a cradle of ancient agriculture, a place where humanity had coaxed wheat from wild grasses and harnessed rivers with mathematics and mud bricks. This was where the Abbasids had once engineered canals so fine-tuned they could calculate water shares to the drop, where Persian Khanats had tunneled cool waters from distant mountains into desert oases, where date palms and pomegranate orchards had fed entire cities. And then came the Mongols. In their path, irrigation systems were trampled, diverted, shattered, aquifers filled with silt. Dams were breached not as part of any grand ecological sabotage, but because they were in the way, or because the men who understood how they worked had been executed, or because, in the chaos, no one was left to repair them. After the siege of Merv, the city's elaborate canal system, centuries in the making, was left untended. The river that fed it, choked by corpses and debris, changed course. Fields dried. The land, once called the mother of cities, became a mother of ghosts. In Khwarezm, where Genghis Khan had unleashed one of his most brutal campaigns, the oasis towns along the Amu Darya were turned into deserts. The Mongols had destroyed the delicate web of irrigation that had turned sand into sustenance. Without constant maintenance, the desert did what deserts do. It took back everything. Baghdad, too, suffered not just a massacre of people, but a slow, irreversible death of land. The intricate Abbasid canal networks that had turned the Tigris floodplain into a breadbasket for the empire were neglected, silted, forgotten. The city, once ringed with farms and gardens, began to starve long after the killing stopped. The destruction wasn't uniform, but it was widespread, from the Indus Valley to the Levant, from the orchards of Balkh to the gardens of Aleppo. The same pattern repeated: conquest, collapse, abandonment. It didn't matter whether the land was fertile, it mattered whether it could be held. And the Mongols, always mobile, didn't care to hold what they couldn't ride. Some regions never recovered. The fallow lands around Nishapur and Herat, once densely farmed, turned into wind-blown plains. In parts of Persia, salt and wind replaced wheat and barley. Deserts expanded their reach, not because of climate, but because civilization had been unplugged. There were ecological echoes, too. When the Mongols decimated local populations, they disrupted centuries of careful land management. Forests were cut for siege engines and never replanted. Wetlands dried out. Invasive species spread through abandoned fields. Even the animal world changed. Herds that once grazed under human control went feral. In some cases, wolves and steppe predators repopulated zones where people had once lived in dense clusters. This was environmental collapse as aftermath. No grand speeches, no evil intention, just the entropy of empire, unleashed too fast and too wide, leaving behind more silence than structure. But not all of it was passive. The Mongols, when faced with resistance, sometimes deliberately destroyed the environment that sustained rebellion. They would poison wells, burn granaries, salt fields. In the siege of Gurganj, they allegedly dammed and redirected rivers to drown the city. In other places, they looted the food stores and left only rot. They knew that starvation was a weapon that kept killing long after the last archer left. And what was lost was not just food, but memory. Ancient irrigation systems, some thousands of years old, disappeared. The knowledge to rebuild them was often oral, held in the minds of engineers, priests, local elders. When those minds were killed or scattered, entire hydraulic civilizations vanished. Some systems have never been rediscovered. Their ruins lie buried beneath the sands of Uzbekistan and eastern Iran, ghost lines in satellite images, tracing where water once flowed. Empires fall, cities burn. But when you kill a landscape, you erase futures. You take not just the past, but the possibility of recovery. The Mongols never stayed long, but their presence was felt for centuries. In the cracked clay where orchards once stood, in the forgotten dams that no longer hum with water, in the villages that never returned. Because conquest doesn't end when the swords are sheathed. Sometimes it ends when the last seed fails to sprout. To the Mongols, gods were not a threat. Walls were. Dogma could be tolerated. Defiance could not. Genghis Khan's empire, for all its brutality, was a strange paradox. A haven for religions and a hell for rebels. You could pray to whomever you wanted, just don't dare stand against the Khan. At the heart of Mongol governance was a practical genius. Genghis Khan understood something many conquerors before him had not. Belief systems, when left alone, pacify populations better than any sword. So he didn't try to convert the world. He didn't burn temples out of spite or ban foreign rituals. Instead, he protected them. Muslim mosques, Christian churches, Buddhist monasteries, Taoist shrines, all were allowed to stand. Priests were spared. Sacred texts were left untouched. In some cases, religious leaders were even exempt from taxes. This wasn't mercy, it was control. Religion soothed people, made them compliant. It gave conquered peoples something to cling to, something to lose if they rebelled. And it made Genghis look not like a destroyer, but like a ruler of divine scope. His laws, the Yasa, even commanded respect for all faiths. It wasn't tolerance in the modern, liberal sense. It was tolerance as policy. He held interfaith debates in his court, hosting Muslims, Buddhists, and Nestorian Christians, letting them argue theology in front of him like a bloodless sport. But he did not care who won, because to Genghis, truth was not a matter of revelation. Truth was what worked, and religion worked when it kept people loyal. In Karakoram, the capital of his empire, temples from every major religion stood side by side. Muezzins called the faithful to prayer, just streets away from Buddhist monks reciting sutras. In a world fractured by religious wars from the Crusades in the West to sectarian struggles in the Islamic world, the Mongols stood apart. They were indifferent to faith and obsessed with obedience. Yet this spiritual freedom coexisted with merciless violence. While you could worship any god, the penalty for resistance, religiously inspired or otherwise, was total annihilation. In Khorasan, Shiite towns that supported local uprisings were erased. In Central Asia, imams who preached rebellion were slaughtered. Faith was tolerated only so long as it bent the knee. The Mongols made no exception for sacred cities. When they approached Nishapur, once a centre of Sufi scholarship, they reduced it to ash. Merv, home to countless madrasas and libraries, was obliterated. Even Baghdad, seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, beacon of Islamic science and theology, was not spared when Hulagu Khan, Genghis's grandson, brought Mongol fury to its gates. The House of Wisdom, one of the greatest centres of learning in the medieval world, was put to the torch. Its books thrown into the river, its scholars executed. The Mongols didn't care that it was holy. It resisted. And that was enough. Still, under Mongol rule, many religions thrived. Christians found surprising safety in the East. Nestorian churches dotted the trade routes from China to the Levant. Buddhist influence deepened in Yuan China. Muslims served in high administrative posts. particularly in the Western Khanates. Even Jews, often persecuted in both Europe and the Islamic world, held positions of power under Mongol protection. This wasn't because Genghis had a progressive worldview. He was an animist, believing in the eternal blue sky and the spirits of his ancestors. But he saw religion as a tool. He used it to rule the diversity of his empire, and he wielded it with the same cold logic he applied to warfare. So long as religion stayed in its lane, it was permitted. But if it ever became a source of unity against him, if faith became the fuel of resistance, it was crushed without hesitation. There's a strange pragmatism in Mongol religious policy, where European kings launched holy wars. Genghis Khan offered tax cuts. Where sultans declared jihad, he declared census. And where priests and imams and monks across the world cursed the Mongol name, he allowed them to do so long as their flocks didn't rise. It is one of history's great contradictions. The empire that annihilated cities and turned rivers black with ink also protected more religious minorities than most of its contemporaries. The same hands that built pyramids of skulls also built roads for pilgrims. Genghis Khan, who left fields littered with the dead, also left sanctuaries untouched. The Mongols didn't care about what you believed. They cared whether you obeyed, and in a strange way, this made them more tolerant than many of their enemies, because they didn't seek to remake the world in their image. They simply demanded that the world bow. In the end, the message was simple: worship how you like. But if you resist, not even your gods can save you. When fire meets parchment, memory dies. And in the wake of the Mongol wave, memory died again and again, burned, drowned, trampled, or simply abandoned to silence. For all the legends of Mongol tolerance and their curiosity about other cultures, the reality is more jagged. The greatest libraries of the medieval world fell before them, like cities under siege, and in many cases, the knowledge of centuries was reduced to ash, never to be recovered. The most infamous of these was Baghdad in 1258. Once called the jewel of the world, the Abbasid capital had been the heart of Islamic science, philosophy, and literature. Its famed Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was more than a library. It was a living mind, a place where Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab thought had been preserved, translated, debated, and advanced. Astronomers plotted the stars there. Physicians copied Galen and Hippocrates in Arabic. Mathematicians refined algebra. Poets wrote verses that echoed through the caliphate. It was, in every sense, a beacon of human thought, and it was obliterated. When Hulagu Khan's forces breached the walls of Baghdad, they did not merely conquer, they annihilated. Thousands of scholars were slaughtered. Books were hurled into the Tigris River in such numbers. Eyewitnesses claimed the water ran black with ink for days. Whether literal or not, the image remains etched in cultural memory. A city of learning, drowned by ignorance and blood. The Mongols had no war against knowledge itself. They did not burn books out of ideology, the way later inquisitors or revolutionaries might. But knowledge was collateral damage. Libraries stood in cities, and cities resisted, and what resisted was punished without mercy. In a world where scrolls were hand-copied and a single manuscript could represent a lifetime of labour, the destruction of one library could erase entire civilizations' worth of science, law, myth, and theology. In Nishapur, Herat, and Merv, other shining centres of Persian and Central Asian culture, the pattern repeated. Entire literate classes were wiped out. Scribes, teachers, scientists, and priests were killed alongside soldiers. Artifacts shattered. Lineages of thought snapped. Local knowledge, everything from irrigation systems to poetry, vanished in the firestorms. Even in China, where the Mongols later established their own dynasty, The cost of initial conquest was devastating. Jin and Western Xia dynastic archives were plundered or lost. Buddhist texts were burned when temples were caught in the sweep of military conquest. Song dynasty scholars, many of whom fled south or died resisting, left behind ghost cities of silenced genius. The Mongols were not Philistines. Genghis Khan himself consulted shamans, astrologers, and scholars. His successors, especially Kublai Khan, supported astronomy, medicine, and statecraft. But they supported knowledge that served power, not knowledge that challenged or evoked memory of resistance. And they drew no distinction between a temple full of sacred scrolls and a fortress if both belonged to an enemy. In their effort to unify the world, they erased much of what had made its parts unique. The destruction wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it was slower. Cities, depopulated by massacre or exile, no longer had the hands to maintain archives. The knowledge remained on shelves but unguarded, uncopied, unread. Ink fades, pages rot. Rodents and time did what fire didn't finish. Generations later, chroniclers searching for records found only dust. And then, there's what we'll never know. The House of Wisdom held countless works, never translated into Latin or preserved elsewhere. Treatises on optics, anatomy, engineering, music theory, and metaphysics that had passed through civilizations like torches through the night snuffed out in 1 week of siege. Not banned, not contested, just gone. The silence that followed wasn't a debate. It was absence. In some cases, even oral cultures were struck. The Mongols deported or dispersed entire populations who carried their histories in song, genealogy, and ritual. Once broken apart, those traditions could not survive. A language without its elders forgets itself quickly. A people without their poets lose their past. The irony is sharp. The Mongols themselves relied on oral tradition. They passed down their own history through songs and memory until it was written down in the secret history decades later. And yet, in expanding their story, they erased so many others. What is lost in war is not just lives. It's continuity, memory, context. With every library reduced to cinders, the future lost a mirror to its past. Philosophies had to be reinvented centuries later, as if for the first time. Scientific breakthroughs delayed. Civilizational self-understanding broken, stitched back together in fragments, often with wrong threads. And the greatest cost? We don't even know how much was lost. The most tragic ruins are the ones that leave no trace. The Mongol conquests reshaped the map of the old world. But beneath that surface, beneath the monuments, the bloodlines, the myths lies another, deeper legacy, an archive of ash, a vast, unknowable library of vanished minds, silenced tongues, and forgotten dreams, fluttering to nothing in the wind that followed the horsemen of the steppe. They said the sky turned red, not with sunset, but with smoke and blood. The chroniclers of the 13th and 14th centuries didn't have modern metrics. They couldn't give us census numbers or death toll graphs. What they gave us was fire and fear, written in ink that still stings the page. And again, they tried to describe the indescribable. In Persia, the historian Juvayni stood among the ruins of Merv, once a great city of scholars and gardens. It had been reduced to silence in 1221. He wrote that the Mongols slaughtered over 700 people there. Was that number real? Maybe not. But that's not the point. What mattered was that it felt real. So many bodies, he said, that the Mongols had to take breaks from the killing to avoid fatigue. When they returned, they used ropes to herd the captives together, so the blades would not have to travel far. Merv died not in an afternoon, but in waves. like the tides of a sea turned crimson. In Baghdad, it was Ibn al-Athir who tried to capture the scale. He lived through it. He called the Mongol invasions an event the like of which has never happened in history, not just because of the killing, but because of how the world seemed to unravel with it. In his chronicles, the Tigris ran black with the ink of books from the House of Wisdom, and red with the blood of its scholars. So complete was the devastation, he wrote, that the eye has not seen, nor the ear heard, of anything to compare with it. From Russia came the Novgorod Chronicle, which spoke of the Mongol incursion as a divine punishment. Villages burned, princes fled. Survivors described the ground frozen not with snow, but with corpses, and the Volga choking on the dead. In Hungary, the Annales Personienses told of smoke that blotted out the sun and fields so full of bones that farmers dared not return for decades. Cities like Pest were emptied in days. The chronicles speak of entire towns crucified on their own gates, each body a warning written in flesh. Chinese sources echoed the same horror. The Jinshi recorded mass executions of civilians after the fall of Zhongdu. Witnesses described children impaled on lances, women thrown from towers, and firestorms that devoured entire neighborhoods in a single breath. Monks wrote of skies darkened by ash for weeks, as though the heavens themselves mourned. These weren't just records, they were cries, people trying to process a horror so vast it unmoored their worldviews. Some turned to prophecy, others to divine punishment. In the Middle East, the Mongols were often seen as Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic destroyers foretold in Scripture. In Europe, they were thought to be the lost tribes of Israel or even demons loosed from hell. Only something supernatural, the chroniclers reasoned, could kill with such precision, such silence, such speed. One Armenian chronicler, Kyriakos of Ganzak, recalled the terror as a boy. He was captured and saw cities around him burn. Later, he wrote that the Mongols would ride into a village and ask only one question: submit or die. Those who submitted were often enslaved. Those who didn't were exterminated. And the Mongols kept records tallying the dead with terrifying calm, like shepherds counting sheep. Even in the chaos, there were those who tried to find order. Rashid al-Din, the Grand Vizier of the Ilkhanate, wrote a more sober account. He tried to rationalize the conquest, to explain its strategy, but even he couldn't hide the magnitude of the bloodshed. The ground, he wrote, was not visible beneath the corpses. And yet, for all the horror, some chroniclers praised the Mongols. Friar John of Plano Carpini, who travelled to the court of the great Khan, admired their discipline, their silence, their unshakable order. He didn't deny their cruelty, but he was awed by its scale. To him, they were the hand of God in the world. Not good, not evil, just unstoppable. That was the terror of it. The Mongols didn't scream when they killed. They didn't rage or boast. They moved like weather, sudden, indifferent, total. So the chronicles filled the silence with metaphor. Blood ran like rivers. The sun was darkened. Cities were levelled to the ground so thoroughly that no trace of habitation remained. One Persian writer said that after the Mongols passed through, dogs and birds avoided the land for months, as if they too feared ghosts. Another wrote simply, "The living envied the dead." These accounts may be exaggerated, the numbers inflated, the tales embellished, but that misses the point. The medieval mind wasn't keeping ledgers, it was screaming into the void. And if every page seems to bleed, it's because the people who wrote them had seen too much. The Mongol conquest didn't just redraw maps, they shattered imaginations. What survives now are echoes, charred letters, fragments of testimony, but across language, faith, and continent, the story is the same. the sky turned red, and the world ended one city at a time. To build an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary, you needed more than horses and arrows. You needed paper, census rolls, grain routes, chains, tax codes, and the willingness to kill entire cities to keep it all working. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer by sword. He conquered by system. Mass death wasn't a glitch in his empire. It was infrastructure at its peak. The Mongol Empire ruled over 100 million people. No phones, no telegraphs, just couriers on horseback galloping across deserts and frozen rivers, carrying commands stamped in Tamga, the seal of the Khan. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history, and making it function meant doing something almost no one before him had done. Treating conquest like administration. Territory wasn't just seized, it was integrated. If it resisted, it died. If it submitted, it was taxed, mapped, and absorbed. But the line between submission and resistance was thin, and intentionally so. The Mongols moved quickly, and they had no patience for drawn-out campaigns. When a city refused to surrender, they destroyed it with such brutality that word would spread ahead of their armies, causing others to capitulate in fear. That fear was a tool. It allowed them to reduce garrisons in newly conquered lands, because the next cities would fold without a fight. Mass slaughter became a form of communication. Obey, or this will happen to you. But there was also cold calculus behind the carnage. The Mongols understood that dead people don't revolt. Dead bureaucrats don't write sedition. Dead scholars don't stir rebellion. So in regions known for resistance, especially urban centres with a tradition of autonomy or theological authority, the killings weren't just punitive, they were preemptive. Eliminating leadership classes made control easier. You couldn't just conquer a people, you had to gut their memory. And yet, the Mongols were not senseless destroyers. They spared artisans, engineers, accountants, anyone useful. These people were relocated, sometimes thousands of miles, to serve the empire elsewhere. The same siege engine designer who built a catapult in Syria might be forced to replicate it in China. The weaver who once made silk for a sultan might now serve the great Khan's court. In the Mongol view, humans were resources like grain, iron, or timber. If you couldn't be used, you could be removed. That logic extended to entire landscapes. Irrigation systems were often neglected or intentionally destroyed if the population proved rebellious. Without water, fields failed. People fled or starved. It was less work than maintaining hostile infrastructure, and it sent a clear message. The empire does not need you. You need the empire. Still, ruling such a vast dominion required more than terror. The Mongols set up census bureaus to know how many people they governed, where taxes could be extracted, where grain needed to be moved, how many soldiers could be levied. These weren't just dry bureaucratic numbers, they were the empire's nervous system. Keeping it functioning meant ruthlessly balancing efficiency and obedience. If any region threatened to wobble out of alignment, a wave of riders would bring it back with fire. The logistics of death were part of governance. In places like Nishapur or Herat, the slaughter was organized. Men divided into squads, moving door to door, counting the dead as they killed. Women and children came last. The Mongols kept tallies, not just for record keeping, but to reward soldiers proportionally. Death was not chaotic. It was audited. And yet, for all the killing, the empire didn't descend into anarchy. Trade flourished. The Silk Road, once a gauntlet of thieves and bribes, became safer under Mongol watch than it had been in centuries. Caravans moved under the banner of the Khan. Merchants, even from enemy nations, were welcomed if they brought wealth. The The same state that had raised cities could offer postal relays every 25 miles. The same rulers who beheaded kings could commission censuses with mathematical precision. This was the paradox. To build a global system, they first had to break the world, and the breaking had to be swift, terrifying, and absolute. Partial conquest invited rebellion, but annihilation, when done quickly and decisively, reduced the need for future wars. The Mongols were not bloodthirsty for its own sake. Their leaders did not bathe in gore or revel in cruelty like later tyrants. Instead, they wielded death with a general's logic. Killing 100, 0 in one city might prevent the deaths of 10, 0 in the next 10 cities. It was arithmetic warfare, terror as a time saver, slaughter as spreadsheet. What they built was terrifyingly effective. From the edge of Europe to the shores of the Yellow Sea, a single political structure imposed order with brutal clarity. Tribes became provinces. Borders became tax districts. Rebellion was treated like infection cut out swiftly before it spread, and when the empire finally fractured, it wasn't because of war weariness or moral awakening. It broke under the weight of its own size. The Khans squabbled. Succession disputes flared. Regional governors gained too much autonomy. And yet, even as it cracked, the ghost of its administrative genius lived on in the successor states, in the Ilkhanate of Persia, the Golden Horde of Russia, the Yuan dynasty of China. The price of that empire was 40 million lives. Some died in battle. Many more died in the aftermath by starvation, disease, relocation, or deliberate culling. But those deaths weren't side effects. They were part of the plan. To rule the world, the Mongols didn't just break kingdoms. They broke the math of survival. And then they rebuilt it on bones, ledgers, and fear. In Mongolia, he is the father of the nation. His face is on the currency. His statue towers over the steppes. His name is spoken with reverence, not fear. But beyond those green hills, Genghis Khan still rides through history as a ghost of fire, a man whose empire left behind not just roads and order, but ash, silence, and tens of millions of graves. This is the paradox of legacy. One man, two stories, a hero to some, a butcher to others, and always a shadow that never fully disappears. To understand how Genghis Khan could be both revered and reviled, you have to separate memory from myth, and myth from geography. In the Mongolian memory, Genghis Temujin was not just a conqueror. He was a unifier, a lawgiver, the man who ended generations of tribal blood feuds, elevated merit over birth, and forged a people from chaos. His yasa, a fluid but fiercely enforced code of law, brought discipline to a culture long fractured by internecine war. He gave his people something they had never truly had, a single identity, a Mongol identity. To them, he was not just the sword of destiny, he was the architect of possibility. But outside of Mongolia, especially in the lands his armies tore through, the legacy is written in blood. In Iran, his name is associated with apocalypse. In China, parts of his campaign are remembered as ethnic trauma. In Russia, he remains the harbinger of centuries of Mongol domination. The farther west you go, the more Genghis becomes mythologized again, but now as a force of destruction, a cautionary tale of what happens when power knows no limits. And yet, history doesn't care about morality. It cares about impact. And few figures in human history have had more. Take genetics. In 2003, scientists studying male Y chromosomes in Central Asia made a startling discovery. Roughly 1 in 200 men alive today, over 16 million share, a nearly identical Y chromosome traceable to a single ancestor. who lived around 800 years ago in the Mongol heartland. The conclusion, while debated, is widely accepted. Genghis Khan fathered a genetic legacy through the elite reproductive privileges of conquest. He didn't just remake the map, he rewrote the gene pool. That legacy extends into geopolitics. Many modern Asian borders trace their shape to the administrative divisions of the Mongol Empire. Routes he carved out in war became arteries of commerce. The Pax Mongolica, brutal though its foundations were, facilitated one of the most dynamic periods of East-West exchange before the Age of Empires. Silk, spices, knowledge, and even gunpowder flowed across continents. So did the plague, but for a brief, burning moment, the world was more connected than ever before. Even in Western historical thought, Genghis Khan eventually began to shift from villain to force of fascination. Enlightenment thinkers marvelled at his meritocratic military ranks. Victorian explorers lionized his ambition. Cold War strategists studied his logistics. And today, in some circles, he's treated not as a tyrant, but as a visionary, someone who understood globalization before the world had the word for it. But reverence, even this late, is selective. It rarely comes from the places that saw their libraries turn to ash, or their rivers clogged with corpses. Those places remember the fire, not the order that followed. Modern Mongolia walks that line with pride and complexity. After centuries under foreign rule, from Manchu domination to Soviet communism, the country reasserted its identity in the 1990s. And central to that revival was Genghis. Statues rose. His name returned to streets, squares, airports. Schools taught his life not as a conquest, but as a redemption arc. He wasn't the destroyer of cities. He was the father who gave them a reason to exist. This isn't just national myth-making. It's survival. For a small, landlocked nation between two giants, Russia and China, leaning into the legacy of Genghis Khan, is a way of claiming continuity, strength, and historical dignity. To the Mongolian people, his rise from a hunted orphan to the ruler of the world isn't just a tale of the past. It's a model of resilience. Yet the rest of the world remains uneasy with the scale of his legacy, because to acknowledge his achievements, his administration, his innovation, his foresight is also to reckon with the human cost. The skull pyramids, the cultural erasures, the incalculable grief. Genghis Khan did not merely conquer people. He erased their memory, scattered their tongues, and sowed new dynasties in their place. So what remains? A name that never quite rests, a DNA strand that appears in millions, a history that can't be told without him. In every classroom that studies empire, every debate about military ethics, every conversation about ends and means, Genghis Khan waits, uncomfortable, unavoidable, not good, not evil, just enormous. That's the legacy of the Khan. It's not carved in stone or chanted in prayer. It's stitched into our very concept of power. When we speak of ruthlessness, total war, or imperial ambition without borders, we are speaking his language, whether we mean to or not. He didn't just change the world, he forced it to change with him, and the echo of his horsemen still rides across the dust of history, whispering a question we've never quite answered. What does it cost to rule everything? The numbers don't scream. They don't beg or weep or whisper prayers. They sit cold on a page, detached, inert 40 million, a number so large it slips through the cracks of human empathy. But behind it are screams. Behind it are cities with no children, rivers thick with corpses, and deserts that were once green. And at the centre of it all, a man with no crown, no palace, and no written language of his own only command. Can a man really kill 40 million? Not with his hands, but with his will. Yes, Genghis Khan did. To ask whether he personally ordered the death of every one of those 40 million is to miss the point. The Mongol conquest was not a storm that passed. It was a choice, repeated across decades, thousands of miles, and in the hearts of men who followed a logic carved from the edge of a blade. Every city burned was a message, every genocide a tactic, every silence a signal. But the question remains, how did historians arrive at that number? Much of it comes not from Mongol records. They rarely recorded such details, but from their victims. Persian chroniclers, Chinese scribes, Arab historians wrote of cities that lost hundreds of thousands. Merv, Nishapur, Urgench, Herat. Some numbers were surely exaggerated, inflated by horror or politics. But the pattern holds. Entire populations were erased, not defeated, erased. The Mongols did not sack and leave. They leveled and salted. They depopulated landscapes. They broke the spine of entire civilizations and watched the limbs wither. And there's another kind of death these numbers rarely capture. Not just lives ended, but cultures undone. Languages that stopped being spoken. Traditions that had no children to inherit them. Fields that turned to dust because the farmers lay in heaps. Waterways that dried up when no one remained to maintain the channels. Death, in Mongol terms, was not only biological, it was systemic, it was civilizational. In ecological terms, the Mongol invasions were so devastating that global carbon levels dipped. Fields reverted to forests. Irrigated zones became wastelands. Human absence reshaped the planet's breath. Few conquerors in history have changed the biosphere. Genghis Khan did. And yet, what he built was not anarchy. It was empire cold, efficient, and expansive. Under Mongol rule, trade routes thrived, borders opened, and paper money flowed. But none of that existed without ruin as its foundation. He remade the world by first unmaking it. That is the true reckoning. Not whether the figure was 40 million, or 30, or 50, but whether a single vision, clear, unmerciful, and absolute, can tilt the axis of history through sheer velocity. And the answer is yes. Temujin, born under a sky too vast to offer comfort, forged unity from fragmentation. His childhood was spent starving. His adolescence was spent fighting. By middle age, he no longer saw humans as individuals, only populations targets to absorb, relocate, or remove. His genius was in logistics. His morality was irrelevant. The world did not need to be good, only his. And in that terrifying clarity of purpose, he became more than a man. He became a force, a storm given form, the avatar of consequence. What, then, do we do with this legacy? Some will revere it. They will point to what came after the diplomacy, the prosperity, the roads stretching from Korea to Kiev. They will call him a unifier, a visionary, a proto-globalist. Others will recoil. They will speak of the bodies, the burned books, the vanished cities that no longer exist even in ruin. Both are correct. To say Genghis Khan killed 40 million is both understatement and overreach. He didn't do it alone. He didn't do it indiscriminately. He did it methodically. He did it with purpose. And in doing so, he rewrote the terms of conquest. He showed the world that to dominate truly, you don't just defeat the army, you obliterate the future. You make memory itself afraid to speak. So no, one man didn't wield the sword that cut down 40 million. He didn't fire every arrow or raise every gate, but he imagined it, he planned it, and history, with all its ruins and red rivers, bent to his vision. That is how a man kills 40 million.